On the morning of December 21, 1944, Brigadier General John Hamilton Hines stood at his artillery command post near Elsenborn Ridge in Belgium. He was orchestrating artillery fire missions that would determine whether the northern edge of the German offensive would break through American lines or be smashed by concentrated firepower. Hines commanded the artillery of the 2nd Infantry Division. At 46 years old, a West Point graduate with 26 years of service, he possessed expertise in artillery that few officers in the European theater could match. The Germans had launched their massive Ardennes offensive 5 days earlier. Over 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, and hundreds of artillery pieces were advancing west toward the Meuse River. The 6th SS Panzer Army, led by Joseph Dietrich, was tasked with seizing Elsenborn Ridge, the high ground controlling roads north of the German breakthrough. If captured, it would give them access to Lisieux, a massive American supply depot 20 miles northwest, threaten First Army headquarters, split the Allied front, and possibly reach Antwerp. The fate of the northern Allied flank depended entirely on holding that ridge, a task that relied on how effectively American artillery could counter German assaults. By December 21st, Hines had assembled the largest concentration of artillery in American history. 348 guns from the 1st, 2nd, 9th, and 99th Divisions, plus heavier 5th Corps artillery, were positioned on and behind Elsenborn Ridge. 16 battalions of 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers, 6 battalions of course-level artillery, every gun registered on likely German approaches, each battery connected by telephone and radio to forward observers with infantry in the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocheroth, below the ridge. Assembling the guns was only half the challenge. Coordinating their fire was the other. December 1944. Artillery doctrine called for sequential fire. One battery fired. Observers adjusted. The next battery fired. Adjustments repeated. This system, used since World War I, gave the enemy time. Time to spot the first shells. Time to disperse. Time to take cover. Time to survive. German infantry could scatter from formations in under 15 seconds once they heard incoming rounds. By the time a second battery fired, many targets had already moved. The central problem: calculating firing data fast enough to allow multiple batteries to fire simultaneously. Traditional fire direction centers relied on tabular firing tables, 76 pages of dense data showing elevations, charges, and fuse settings for every range and condition. Officers trained in advanced mathematics had to cross-reference pages, interpolate values, and apply corrections for weather. Each calculation could take 3 to 5 minutes per battery. In combat, those minutes often meant the difference between hitting exposed enemy forces or empty ground. This problem had been recognized before the war, but solving it required someone who understood both the mathematics of ballistics and the practical frustrations of field artillery. That person was National Guard Captain Abbott Harrington Burns. Burns was unconventional, a West Point graduate who resigned his commission to work in civilian construction. Reactivated in 1940 by the National Guard, initially assigned to cavalry, he quickly requested a transfer to artillery, openly admitting he hated horses. His superiors approved, likely relieved to move a horse-loathing officer. By mid-November 1940, Burns arrived at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, assigned to a Fire Direction Center training team. Fort Sill, home of the U.S. Army Field Artillery School, spanned 94,000 acres of prairie, equipped to test every artillery type. At that time, the base was rapidly expanding in preparation for possible war. New barracks under construction, training accelerated. Officers rotated through abbreviated courses to prepare for deployment. Burns intended to finish the course and return to a civilian construction job in Arizona. But the assignment changed everything. Burns' first encounter with tabular firing tables confirmed his suspicions. The system was painfully slow. The massive book contained 76 pages of data for each artillery piece and ammunition type, each page showing elevations, charges, and fuse settings in 50 to 100 meter increments. If the target was at an odd range, officers had to interpolate between values. A single fire mission involved a forward observer calling coordinates, the fire direction center plotting the target, calculating range and deflection, opening the firing table, applying elevation, charge, fuse, drift, meteorological, and altitude corrections. The process could take 3 to 5 minutes. For one battery, slow but workable. Coordinating multiple batteries, impossible. By the time the second battery calculated data, German infantry had dispersed, armor moved, and targets vanished. Burns realized the issue wasn't math. Ballistics calculations were correct. Tables were accurate. The bottleneck was accessing data quickly. No amount of training could speed up flipping through 76 pages. Burns, with West Point engineering training and civilian construction experience, knew recurring calculations could be mechanized. Slide rules, familiar to engineers, demonstrated this principle. Could a slide rule be adapted for artillery? Traditional slide rules handled multiplication and division, not artillery calculations. But the principle worked. If scales could represent relationships in the firing tables, range, elevation, charge, answers could be read directly, eliminating table searches. One evening in late November 1940, Burns stayed late at Fort Sill. Classrooms empty. Other officers at the club or quarters. He sat with firing tables, graph paper, ruler, and pencil. 2 hours of sketching later, he realized he didn't need every table value, only the relationships between range, elevation, and charge. Burns created linear scales for range and elevation, aligned, so setting the cursor to a range revealed elevation instantly. No tables. The next evening, he refined the scale, added drift and fuse corrections, experimented with layouts for readability. By the end of the second evening, a working design emerged. A wooden base roughly 10 inches long, scales printed on the surface, a clear plastic cursor with a hairline for precise readings. He constructed a prototype from Fort Sill materials, a crate strip for wood, paper scales glued on, acetate for the cursor. Crude, but functional. Testing against firing tables. Set the cursor, read elevation. Perfect match. In 20 seconds instead of 3 minutes. Other officers were polite, but uninterested, comfortable with tabular methods. Some hostile, dismissing it as a gimmick. But one officer saw the potential. Major George Vivek Kaiser, an instructor with extensive artillery experience. Kaiser immediately recognized the revolutionary possibilities. He urged Burns to abandon the Arizona job. The device needed refinement, testing, and adoption. Burns hesitated, wary of bureaucracy. But Kaiser's persistence, rank, and influence convinced him to stay. Over 3 months, Burns and Kaiser refined the graphical firing table, smoothing designs, adapting for all powder charges and weapon systems, and extensively testing at Fort Sill. Officers could calculate firing data 20 times faster. Enlisted men with basic math could now perform calculations once reserved for engineers. Adoption by the Army was slow. Fort Sill immediately used it for training, but the War Department acted cautiously. Burns grew frustrated, pinning reminders of bureaucratic resistance above his desk. Kaiser pushed relentlessly, advocating the device. By early 1942, the Army officially produced graphical firing tables, teaching them to artillery officers heading to combat. By mid-1944, thousands had been manufactured and distributed across Europe and the Pacific. The graphical firing table was elegantly simple, a 10-inch wooden ruler with scales on both sides, different scales for ammunition, charges, and weapons, sliding cursor with hairline for precise readings. Drift, elevation, fuse, and range became instantly accessible. Fire direction crews could now calculate an entire battery's firing data in the time it previously took to reference one page. The innovation was magnified when paired with time on target, coordinating multiple batteries so all shells landed simultaneously, regardless of distance. Closer batteries fired later. Distant batteries fired first, shells converging within 3 seconds. The effect was devastating. Sequential shelling gave defenders time to react. Simultaneous impact left none. Maximum casualties occurred while troops were still exposed. Previously theoretical, this tactic relied on the speed of the graphical firing table. Tabular methods were too slow. By December 1944, many U.S. artillery units in Europe had graphical firing tables, though proficiency varied. Some routinely used time-on-target techniques. Others relied on traditional methods due to prior training or conservatism. The device was equipment, not doctrine. Units chose whether to adopt it. But at Elsenborn Ridge, where artillery concentration was immense, its advantages were undeniable. On December 16th, the German offensive began. American forces were caught by surprise. Intelligence had completely missed the German buildup. Over 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, and hundreds of artillery pieces massed in the Eifel Mountains. Overcast weather grounded Allied reconnaissance. Night movements and disciplined radio silence ensured near-total surprise. The inexperienced 99th Infantry Division held the northern line in front of Elsenborn Ridge. Green troops, deployed only in November, stretched thin across 22 miles with no reserves. Commanders assumed the Ardennes sector posed low risk, rugged terrain, poor roads, unsuitable for major offensives. That assessment was catastrophically wrong. Behind the 99th, the veteran 2nd Infantry Division prepared for limited operations near Wallerscheid. Known as the Indian Heads, they were battle-hardened from months in the Hürtgen Forest. Now facing one of the war's most critical defensive battles, the German assault struck at 0530 hours, December 16th. Artillery opened across a 50-mile front. In the northern sector, over 1,000 German guns initiated the bombardment. Nebelwerfer rocket launchers and mobile artillery pounded positions for 90 minutes. Searchlights reflected off clouds, creating artificial moonlight for accurate targeting. The effect was terrifying. American soldiers survived physically, thanks to deep foxholes and log coverings. But psychologically, the intensity shocked even seasoned troops. At 0700, German infantry advanced. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division and elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division pushed toward the Lischem Gap and the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. The 1st SS Panzer Division, under SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, drove through the southern sector toward Malmedy and the Meuse River. The German plan demanded rapid progress. Seize the twin villages on day 1. Capture Elsenborn Ridge by day 2. Reach the Meuse within 3 to 4 days. Antwerp within a week. Timelines were critical. By December 21st, Hines had the greatest concentration of artillery in American history. Every gun was registered on likely approaches, battalions linked by telephone and radio, and forward observers constantly reporting enemy movements. The combination of graphical firing tables and time-on-target coordination meant American artillery could deliver massed, simultaneous strikes. Every shell from multiple batteries could land at the same instant, maximizing casualties and suppressing German advances. Traditional sequential fire would have allowed German forces to scatter, survive initial salvos, and reorganize. Instead, precise timing left no opportunity for reaction. Hines, Burns, and Kaiser's innovations turned theory into battlefield reality. By controlling firepower with speed and precision, the Americans leveraged technology to compensate for troop inexperience and overwhelming enemy numbers. The stage was set at Elsenborn Ridge, a small section of high ground that would determine the fate of the northern Allied flank. German forces, confident after initial bombardments, advanced expecting weak resistance. They were met by synchronized American artillery, calculated with speed no traditional method could achieve. Every infantry formation in the open was cut down before it could respond. Tanks and mobile artillery, moving into position, faced lethal concentrations of fire. The Americans held the ridge, their artillery dictating the tempo and outcome of the battle. The innovations of Burns and Kaiser, once dismissed as homemade contraptions, proved decisive. The graphical firing table allowed multiple batteries to fire simultaneously, effectively multiplying the lethal potential of every gun. Time-on-target tactics, previously theoretical, became a reality. German forces faced precision strikes that decimated units before they could react. The Battle of Elsenborn Ridge became a testament to American ingenuity and adaptability. The combination of high-concentration artillery, graphical firing tables, and precise time-on-target coordination reshaped modern artillery doctrine. Brigadier General Hines' command, Abbot Burns' mechanical genius, and Major Kaiser's vision together created a system that changed the course of the Ardennes offensive. The ridge held. The northern flank of the Allies remained intact. Supply depots, headquarters, and the path to Antwerp were preserved. American artillery, once limited by slow calculations, had become an unstoppable force. The innovations of the 1940s, Fort Sill officers had transformed into battlefield reality, proving that speed, precision, and technology could turn the tide of war.